Promises! Yes, so promise is the most important topic you should know if you are a JavaScript developer. If you are giving a front-end interview, then definitely 100% there will be questions around promises. Knowing promises will not just help you in your interviews, but will also help you become a better JavaScript developer while you are doing your day-to-day coding. See, I can tell you what promises are in just 5 to 10 minutes. But no, I won't do that. In this video, we will be diving deep into promises just like how we do, right? And we will explore the beauty of promises. We'll see how beautiful promises are. So that's why this episode can go a little long, but I promise that you will fall in love with promises after watching this video. So I just please request your attention and just keep watching this episode of Namaste JavaScript Season 2. So now listen to me very carefully. Promises are used to handle async operations in JavaScript. Now I will take a code example and will show you how things used to work before promises and then how it used to work after promises. Let's just begin. Let's dive into the code now. So I will take a example. Suppose we are creating an e-commerce website like Amazon, right? So we have cart in it. Suppose we have a cart in it. Let's call it as const cart. Right? So this cart is nothing but an array. For the sake of simplicity, I will just use strings over here. Okay. And let's add some items to the cart. What items should we add? Let's add shoes and tell me some products. Okay. Let's add pants. Let's add kurta to it. Why not? Right? So let's add kurta. Right? So this is our cart. Every e-commerce website has a cart. Along with the cart, suppose we have two more APIs. Let's call them as create order API. Right? This API takes cart to it, right? Takes the cart items and will return us the order details or an order ID, right? What this will do is this will create an order in our database or whatever it will do and will give us an order ID. It will create an order, right? And then there is one more API. Let us call that as proceed to payment, right? This API basically proceed to payment. Okay, this API will then take this order ID and will take you to the payment page, or this will proceed to payment, right? So now what will happen is these two APIs are asynchronous. Create order is asynchronous, proceed to payment is asynchronous. We don't know how much time it will take, right? And they are dependent on each other, right? So we can only do proceed to payment once we have created the order. Make sense? Right? So now let us see that how we used to write this code using callbacks, right? Callbacks used to be very crucial part when writing asynchronous code in our programming. So how we handle this type of situation in our code using callbacks is that we wrap this function inside a callback function, right? This proceed to payment, we will wrap it inside a callback function. And what we used to do is we design our APIs in such a way that we pass this callback function. Let us just grab this and we'll pass this callback function to create order API, right? This used to be the case. Now it is the responsibility of create order API to create an order first of all, and then we'll call our callback function back once the order is created with the order ID. So this is how we used to handle async operations using callbacks. But my dear friends, there is a very important issue with this code. What is that issue? If you have seen my previous video, you would have guessed it already. Yes, that issue is inversion of control. So what does that mean is that we have given this callback function, we have passed this callback function to create order API. And now we are just sitting back relaxed as a developer that at some point of time, this create order function will just call our callback function back and everything will be peaceful. But what if we are just blindly trusting this create order API and it never calls our callback function back? Or it might call it twice. Who knows? Because this create order API can be in some other service, can be in some external world, can be written by some other developer or some other team or some intern, and we can't just blindly trust these APIs, isn't it? So what I mean to say is that we have given the responsibility of our code proceed to payment to some other API, and it's not in our control anymore. We have just passed in and we are just expecting it to be like randomly magically being called after the order is created. Isn't it risky? So passing callback functions like this isn't reliable. We are just giving the control of our program to some other part of our code which we are not aware of, isn't it? This is not a very confident way of writing code. So how we can solve this? So now let us just see that how we can handle this type of situation using promises. Okay. So what will happen is, if we were designing these APIs, so we would have designed our create order API in such a way that whenever we, this API, right, create order API will no longer take a callback function. It won't take a callback function, but it will just take card details, right? And what it will do is it will return us a promise. What is a promise? I will tell you. So we will capture that promise into a variable. Let us call it as promise, right? So whenever you call this line, right, whenever this line is executed by JavaScript, this create order API will return us a promise. And promise is nothing but you can assume it to be an empty object, right? Empty object with some data value in it, right? And this data value will hold whatever this create order API will return to us, right? So now listen to me very carefully. This create order API is an async operation. It will take some time to execute, but we don't know how much time it will take. This create order API might take 5 seconds, 6 seconds, or we don't know how much time it will take. But as soon as this line is executed, it will return us an object, right? It will return us an object with a data with some empty undefined property, right? Undefined or an empty value, right? What does undefined means? An empty value. It will just assume that it is returning us an empty object with some property data, and it is undefined, not defined at that moment itself. And suppose after 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 10 seconds, whenever, how much ever time it takes, what it will do is it will create an order and will give us order details and will fill this object back at some later point of time. Got it? I will repeat it once again. Listen to me very carefully because this is very important. Whenever JavaScript engine will execute this line, right? So this create order API will return us a promise. Promise is nothing but an empty object over here. And what will happen is the program will just go on executing. Suppose if there are more lines of code over here, they will start executing. And after 5 seconds, 6 seconds, or how much ever time it takes, what will happen is this promise object, this empty object will be filled with data automatically. Right? This promise object will fill this data automatically, and we will have order details in it after whatever async time it takes. Got it? This is what promise is. So now you can ask me a very important question, that what will happen once we have these order details, once we have this data with us? How do we continue our program? What will happen to proceed to payment? Yes, I will tell you what happens. So what we will do is, now we will attach a callback function to this promise object, right? And how do we do that? I'll show you. So we will use a function .then. This is a function which is available over promise object. This is the promise object. We can use promise object, right? Whatever we call it as, we will use promise.then, and we will attach a callback function using this then function. Okay. We will have this callback function that we used to pass in earlier, and we will attach it to our promise object. Now what will happen is, whenever, right, earlier this data used to be undefined, right? This was empty. As soon as JavaScript engine executed this line, this was undefined, this was empty. But after certain point of time, this will be filled with exact data that will be returned by create order API, right? Here we will have order details, right? And once we have data inside this promise object, what will happen is this callback function that we attach to this promise object will be automatically called, right? So this is how we write code in world of promise, and this is how we used to do earlier, right? So now I know that you might have a lot of doubts in your mind that, Akshay, what are you smoking? This is looking more complicated than callbacks, right? The earlier solution. How did you help us, right? We are still using callbacks over here, right? So what improvement did we make in our code? I will tell you, my dear friends, this piece of code is a lot better than this piece of code. How? Can you guess? I will tell you. Listen to me very carefully. What we did in the earlier solution was we passed this function to create order API, and we were blindly trusting create order API. We were relying on it. And in this case, we are attaching a callback function to a promise object. There is a difference. First one, we were passing this callback function to another function, right? And here we are attaching a callback function to a promise object. There is a difference between these words, passing a function and attaching a function. So what happens in this case is we just pass this function, and now create order API would have called it whenever it wants to, right? And in this case, we will have the control of our program with us, right? How? That create order API will only do its job. It will create an order, and it will fill the promise object with the data, the order ID, whenever it wants to. And as soon as this promise object is filled with that data, it will automatically call our callback function back. And we will have the control of our program with us. Promises gives us this trust, and promises gives us this guarantee that it will call this callback function whenever there is data inside the promise object. And in the earlier piece of code, we had a lot of doubts, right? That what if this create order API might call our function twice or thrice, or it might never call it. Promises handles it beautifully. What will happen is, as soon as we have data inside promise, it will call this function definitely 100% of the time. That is the guarantee given by JavaScript, right? And it will call it just once and only once. And we will also have control of our program with us, as we are not passing our code to some other external function. Isn't it beautiful to have this guarantee and surety as a developer? It's beautiful, my dear friends. So I told you that, okay, promise object is an empty object with some data field or something. No, it is much more special, and it is much more advanced than that. Okay, now I will show you the real promise object. We are diving deep now. Okay, we will just exactly see how promise objects look like. Just let me write some code to show you that. Okay, so if you want to see that object, we will use a function fetch. If you are writing JavaScript code, then you would have already been familiar with this fetch function. It is basically an API given by browsers to us to make external calls. So now we will use this fetch function to make an API call to GitHub servers, and will get a user info with us. So this open source API gives us the info of this username. I have written down my GitHub username over here. So I'm just taking this as an example. So what we will do is we will try to fetch this user info from this API. Okay. And by design, this fetch function, right? This fetch function returns us a promise. Just like I was telling in create order API right here. So this fetch function will return us a promise, and let us just capture that promise into an object which is known as user. Okay, and we will pass this GitHub API over here. Now, my dear friends, what will happen is, as soon as this line of code is executed, we will get a promise object inside this user. Okay, so fetch returns us a promise. Okay, and let us dive deep into the console, and what we will do is, let us just go to sources. Let me just add a debugger over here. So I have added a debugger before this line is executed. Now, as you can see, user is right now undefined, but you will slowly see, as soon as this line is executed, this line number 15, what will happen is, as soon as this fetch function will be called, a promise object is going to be returned inside a user object. And let us now see how does that promise object looks like. Let me just run it. Yes, see. Now, this is the promise object, my dear friend. Are you able to see this? Let me just zoom a little bit here. And just, oh my God, I'm not able to show you. Let me just, yes. So this is a promise object over here, right? this is an empty object that I was showing you over here. And let us just see what is inside this promise object. So we have a prototype over here, and we have promise state, and we have promise result. And whatever I was telling you, that empty object and then data is equals to undefined, it is this, right? So right now this promise is in a pending state. So what are the state of a promise? I will tell you. There are two things. One is the state of a promise and one is the result. So result will store whatever data it returns, right? Whatever the data that fetch method will return, this will be stored inside promise result. And promise state tells you that in what state that promise is. Initially, the promise will be in pending state, and once we have got the data back, remember I was telling you that it might take 4 seconds, 5 seconds for that asynchronous operation to get completed. So after that, that promise state changes to fulfilled state. Now I'll show you something really interesting, okay? So let's move to the console, and over here, suppose if I am writing console.log of user, let's just print user. So before I run this code, just can you guess what this console log user will do? So what will happen when JavaScript runs this code is, it will just have, this is a normal code, right? And once this line 15 is executed, fetch will return us a promise, like user promise, and this console log will log that promise. So what do you think at this point of time on line number 17, the state and the result of promise will be? Remember, this is an async operation. It takes some time to execute. What will it log here? Pending or fulfilled? Interesting question, right? Let us just see. So my dear friends, it is logging pending. And if I expand it, so it shows you fulfilled. You know, it took me like 5 days and like 6 Red Bulls to find out that why is this pending and this is fulfilled. You know, this inconsistency is just in Chrome browser, don't worry, is a part of Chrome browser, but it generally, I'll explain you why it is behaving in this way. So actually what happens is, when this console log statement is executed, at this point of time, the user, the promise object, is in a pending state. Okay. How? Because JavaScript engine executes. JavaScript engine does not wait for anything. It just quickly executes whatever is there, right? So it just executes line number 13, then 15, then 17. In line number 15, fetch returns a promise, and that promise at that particular time is in a pending state. It takes some time to get the data and fill it back, right? To get fulfilled. But JavaScript does not wait for that, right? It just goes on and prints console log into the console. And that's why this promise is pending over here. But what does Google Chrome does is, after some point of time, right? After eventually, this data will come into this promise object. So if you expand it, it shows you the current state of the promise. So that's why this is fulfilled right now. But when it was logged, it was in pending state. So that's why this inconsistency, but assume, okay? But right now, at this point of time, the promise has been fulfilled. And as I told you that this result, right, promise result, which was undefined earlier, I showed you over here, right, using a debugger. So which was undefined is now filled with our response. And if I open that, we have body, we have headers, we have a lot more things over here. So that data is inside this body. This is a readable stream. Right? So we can't just see a readable stream like this, right? But it is there. There's a way to extract it. We can convert this readable stream into a JSON and extract it. But what I want to tell you is that promise right now is in fulfilled state. This is how a fulfilled promise looks like. Earlier it was in pending, and after that async operation is done, it just fulfills it. Now, what if we had some callback attached to this promise object, right? How do we attach it? I'll show you, right? Then, and we had a function, a callback function over here. And what we can do is here, right? If we have this data, so this data, the result over here, this data will come over here and we can just use this, right? We can just use this as we want to. We can just do whatever we want to with this data. And that's how we attach callbacks to promise. So whatever needs to be done after we have data inside our user object, that needs to go in like this. So if I save this, so we get this response over here, this data, right? And we can use this in our program. We can do whatever we want to with this data. So that's how we generally handle promises. So let us just get back. So this is how, my friends, a promise object looks like. And this is a spatial object in JavaScript. So this spatial promise object brings a lot of trust in this transaction, because JavaScript guarantees that this promise object can only be resolved once. Either it will be success or a failure. Over here it is fulfilled. It can be rejected also. Okay. And the state can be only 3 inside a promise. There can be only 3 states. One is pending, one is fulfilled, and one is rejected. If we go to the MDN documentation, let us just see. See, there can be only 3 states inside the promise. One is pending, fulfilled, and rejected. That's all 3 states it can have, right? So this brings us a lot of trust in the transaction. And one more important thing is that promise objects are immutable. What does that mean? So whenever it is fulfilled and whenever we have data inside our promise object, we can just pass it here and there in our code, and we don't have to worry about that someone can mutate that data. So if you would want to do a user dot data dot something equal to something, you can't just edit this user now, right? This is so great as a developer, right? Because you have control over this object, right? This promise data, and there is a way to attach handlers to it using then, right? So that's how we do that, and nobody can mutate it. It's immutable and resolve just once, and you can pass in wherever you want to. Such a beautiful thing, isn't it? So now, my dear friend, let us talk about interviews, right? The most interesting part. How do you answer question in your interviews? For that, let me just get rid of this, right? I will tell you. So what if your interviewer tells you that what is promise? What is a promise in JavaScript? How do you answer that question? What is this promise? How would you answer that? I'll tell you, just listen to me very carefully. There are a lot of different definitions of promises running all across the internet. Okay. So some people call this promise object as a placeholder, right? Placeholder, which will be filled later with a value. Make sense? Promise object is a placeholder for a certain period of time until we receive a value from a asynchronous operation. Isn't it? So this is one definition. The other definition, some people would like to call it as a container for a future value. Some people use the word future value for this value which it will have after the promise is resolved, right? So it's a container for a future value. Some people like to call it like that. And there is one more definition of promises over MDN documentation, which I personally like now. But first time when I read it, right, I got a headache while I was trying to understand what does it trying to say by this line, right? But now I find that this is the most beautiful definition of promises. Let us just try to understand this. And now when I have explained you a lot, right? So this will make sense to you now. So promise is an object representing eventual completion of an asynchronous operation. Sounds complicated, right? But no, it is not. I'll tell you. So this promise over here is an object that represents an eventual completion of an asynchronous event. Okay. Sounds complicated. Let me break it down to you. Promise is an object that you can remember represents the eventual completion of an asynchronous operation. Because see, this is an asynchronous operation, create order, and it will eventually be completed. So promise is an object representing eventual completion of an async operation. Just try to remember it once again. Promise is an object representing eventual completion of an async operation. Eventual completion, right? Eventually completed, and async operation. That's how MDN defines promises to be. I find that definition more technical and more precise and more beautiful for the interviews, because sometimes if you just say that container over a future value, then you would have to back your answer with a lot of explanation. But if you'll say to your interviewer that promise is an object that represents an eventual completion of an async operation, I dare you, he won't ask you anything except this. For promises, you would know that you know promises already. Okay, so that's how. Try to remember it. It's very easy. Once again, promise is an object which represents the eventual completion of an async operation. Eventual completion of async operation. Async operation to samajh mein aata hai, right? Eventual completion, async operation as it is an object. Easy, yaar. I know that this video is getting a little longer, but please give me 5-10 more minutes. I want to explain just one more topic in this video, and then in the next video, rest of the things. Okay, so let me just close my browser. Let's get back to code again. Now listen to me very carefully. This is the last part of the whole explanation which I wanted to give. Okay, so what will happen is we solved inversion of control, which was a major issue while using callbacks, right? We were giving control of our code to something else. But there is one more issue with callbacks, right? If you have seen my previous video, you would know that there was an issue of callback hell. I'll just quickly explain you what it is right now if you haven't watched my video. Though, watch that video also. But I'll quickly explain it over here also. So suppose in an e-commerce website, what we do is we create an order. Then we have a proceed to payment. Then we have an API. Suppose we have an API for show order summary, right? Once the payment is done, we show an order summary, right? Which takes payment info. And there is one more API, suppose update wallet balance, balance, right? So once the order summary is shown, so just update the wallet balance. Okay, so it just update the wallet balance. Okay, so now how do we, and these are dependent on each other. Okay, once we do create order, then we do proceed to payment, then we do show order summary, then we update the wallet, right? It happens in a sequence. So what will happen is, how do we used to write this type of code in our old fashioned, right, the callback way? So we used to have a callback which have this show order summary, and we used to pass this callback, right? This callback method. We used to pass this callback method into our proceed to payment. Remember, this is how we wrote code. Let me just make it a little more readable to you. Okay, and what will happen is, now if you see clearly, we have our create order, then proceed to payment, then show order summary. And once the order summary is shown, then we will do update balance. So we have another callback. And when we write this type of code, when we have a lot of APIs which depend on each other, so we tend to fall into a callback hell. This is known as callback hell. Now our code starts to grow horizontally instead of vertically, isn't it? This is also known as pyramid of doom. And if suppose we have more if and else cases, more nested callbacks, then this code becomes very ugly and hard to maintain. You don't know how and where what API is being ending, right? So this we want to avoid. Promises helps us avoid this as well. And this is handled using promise chaining. So promise comes with an important feature of promise chaining. Yes, that term sounds very complicated, but it is not. I'll show you that how we can write this type of code using promises. If suppose these APIs were returning us promises, how do we handle this type of situation? Okay, so this is the way of writing promises. So if you see it clearly, then this create order API was returning us a promise, and then we were attaching a callback function to this create order API's returned promise. So this is a way to do that. Or we could have just, instead of doing promise.then, we could have we can just do a .then after this create order API. So this is same, right? So it is equivalent to writing this, right? So this create order API will return us a promise, and then we will attach a callback function over here, right? So this is same as getting a variable and then attaching then to it, or we can just simply write like this using promises, right? So suppose if after proceed to payment, we also had to show order summary. So what we could have done is, we could have just added one more then statement after this, right? And we would have just attached another callback function to this promise chain, right? This is known as promise chaining, and we would have just done show order summary over here. and instead of payment info, let's just add payment info over here. So that's all. That's how we would have handled it inside our promise world, right? And what if there was update wallet balance also? So we would have added one more callback to this chain, right? And we would have done update wallet over here, right? Let me just show it to you. So our code would have become lean by writing like this. So one more important thing to note over here is that a lot of developers fall into that issue, right? There is a bug in a lot of code, right? You would pull your hairs if you will fall in that bug. Is that whenever you are attaching a lot of then function and lot of callbacks in this promise chain, what happens is we used to pipe the data, right? We want this data to flow in the whole chain. What will happen is whatever is the response of this create order should pass into this chain, and then whatever is the response of this proceed to payment should pass down the chain, and then whatever is there returned from show order summary should pass down the chain. For that, you have to take care in mind that you return from here. Okay, so we always return a promise from a promise when we are chaining it, right? So that's when we will get data properly into our chain. And a lot of times we as developer forget to write this, right? So just make sure that you are doing this when you are handling it. So this is how we write code, and our code does not grow horizontally, but it is in a meaningful chained fashion. Okay, so this is how we write this piece of code inside promises. And one more thing, some developers also prefer to use arrow functions over here, right? That makes it a little more lean. I don't want to question about readability, but the code will look something like this. If you will have arrow functions over here, we can just get rid of return statement. So some developers find it much more readable like this. Okay, so they kind of just remove all these returns and all, right? Because there is just one line over here in our arrow function. So they just prefer to just write the code like this. So this basically looks a little more lean, but I don't want to comment over the readability. It is developer's choice and how you follow. But I personally like the older syntax with function keyword better, right? That is my way of coding, but some developers like to write code like this also. I just wanted to show you that this code growing horizontally is now converted to this evenly fashioned vertical written code and a promise chain. Make sense? So this is known as promise chaining, and it helps us get out of callback hell. Isn't it beautiful, my dear friends? It's so beautiful. Promises gives us so many amazing functionalities that what we had to do in our previous callback fashion would have messed up our code so much. It just messes up. I have seen repositories where a lot of code here and there written in random order, and promises just makes our code much more beautiful and cleaner and generates trust in that transaction. So this was a very long video, and now let us just quickly recap whatever we studied in this video very quickly. Okay, so first of all, we saw that, okay, how we can handle our async code in using callbacks, and there is a major issue in this callbacks. While using callbacks, that is inversion of control. We were passing a function inside another API, and we were given control of our program to some other API, which we wanted to avoid. That was inversion of control. And how did we solve it? We basically had a promise object, and that promise object will be eventually filled with a result of async operation, right? That promise object, and we don't pass a function inside any other function, but what we do is we attach a callback function to that promise object, and whenever we have data inside or whenever the promise is resolved, that callback function will automatically be called by promises, right? Beautiful thing, isn't it? And what happens is promise gives us guarantee and trust in our whole transaction. How? Because you can resolve promise just once, and you can only have 3 states for promises, either pending or fulfilled or rejected. There is no other state. You can pass promise wherever you want to without caring about the mutability of it. It is immutable. You cannot alter a promise if it is resolved. So promise comes with a lot of trust. And then we also saw that beautiful looking promise object. Remember that? Okay. It was a special object, right? Which had two major properties. One was the promise state and the other one was promise result, which used to hold data. Remember? Which eventually get filled, right? Which eventually gets filled, right? And then I also told you that how do you have to answer a question that what is a promise in the interviews? How? Remember that definition? I bet you would have forgot it right now. Let me just recap it once again. So the promise is an object that represents eventual completion of an async operation. Eventual completion of an async operation. It's very easy. Just remember it once. Say it yourself. Promise is an object that represents eventual completion of an async operation. That async operation will be eventually completed. So it's an object that represents it. Right? Very easy. Just say it 2-3 times. You will just remember it. For life. It's so beautiful. Okay, we saw that how do we answer that, and then later on we also discussed that okay, there is one more issue using callbacks, that is callback hell, right? And then we can use promise chaining, right, to handle that type of issue. And then we have a beautiful looking promise chain with us. We can use then to attach a lot of callback handlers for our promise, and we can just do that. And then I also discussed one more thing which you need to be careful about, that whenever there is a promise, right, inside that promise chain, right, so you might have to return that promise once again into the chain, otherwise you might lose some data inside the chain, right? So these were the things which I discussed in this video. I hope you liked it and you would see promises the same way like you used to see earlier. Promises are much more beautiful, much more beautiful. So in the next video, I will cover that how we can create our own promise. Isn't it beautiful? Right now in this video, we just saw that how we can consume a promise, right? Fetch function created a promise and gave us to us, right? The create order, we were assuming that this create order API will give us a promise. But now we will, in the next episode, we will see that how we can create a promise and return from this create order API. Okay, we will try to write our own implementation of this create order API. How will I create a new promise and return it, right? Because I am also a developer, I want to create promises and send it around to people to generate trust in our transaction, isn't it? So we will see that how we can create a promise in the next episode. This was about consuming promises. That episode is going to be mind-blowing. Just keep watching Namaste JavaScript Season 2. And now it's time for homework of this episode. So what you have to do is, first of all, you have to explain in the comments that what if the interviewer asks you what is a promise, how would you answer that? Don't see other comments, just write your own definition with the exact same line over there. Okay, what will you answer? First question is, what is a promise? According to you, just write it down. And then second thing, why promises are important? How would you explain it to the interviewer? Write it down, that will help you. Please, this is a very important episode, and I'm telling you, this is the most important video episode of Namaste JavaScript. So I want you to take away a lot of things from this episode. If you have doubts about anything, just comment it down, just see the video once again and just do this homework. 2 questions. First is, how would you answer a question about what are promises in JavaScript? And the second one is, why do we use promises? What is the advantages of it? Explain it in your own terms. In the comments, I would love to read all the answers. I will give you a heart if I like your answer. Please do that. Please do the homework. This is really very important. It just takes 5 minutes before you go away from this video. Please do that. And in the next episode, I will be coming up with creating our own promises. So go check out the next video, but finish your homework right now before you move from this video. And thank you so much for watching Namaste JavaScript Season 2. Promise object represents eventual completion of an async operation. Promise object represents eventual completion of an async operation. Promise object represent eventual completion of an async operation. Promise object represents eventual completion of an async operation. Promise object represents eventual completion of an